Mm. Mm. Good evening. Hello. Can you hear me?
Good evening, sir.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. After 2 days gap, we are meeting again, and I have some problems with my PPT. That's why I'm a bit delay. Uh, 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 can you see the PPT now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll now we'll read more about 20th century poetry, Australian poetry today. The focus is on 20th century poetry, but one thing is very clear. A funny thing I would like to share, an anecdotal thing that I would like to share with you all. Actually, the thing was, um, I found I found I came to know from some reliable source that people, those who are attempting responses in this paper, are they fail to make to distinguish between what is a poetry and what is a novel. Sometimes what they do is they mention the name of a poem as a name of a novel in the answer papers, and that should be stopped immediately. If you do this course, please go to the details and have some basic idea, then try to write something. If possible, you can do one thing. You can attempt at least some writing practice before the actual um, appearance in the examination, so that you can have some confidence going with you. If you do not have confidence, you can write anything that comes to your mind, and that in that way you are not going to score, you are not going to justice to the paper of MEG-9 Australian literature. That is why please have a brief summary of what you want to do, at least two questions from each unit. Or one question from each unit you will have to attempt, so that what is there, or what is a poem, what is a novel, what is a short story, you must distinguish between or among the branches of literature. Otherwise things won't be helpful to you, and you have to um, put yourself in problems. All your efforts will go in vain if you do not write the way you want to write, if you do not score the marks the way you expect to score, that is why I would advise all of you to have some practice before you go to write your answers in the uh, your examination. Okay, right. So this is what I wanted to share with you. A funny sharing that somebody told me in this paper how people write or how students candidates write their answers, and you will have to find out the solution to this problem. Problem is there, and you have to find out the solution and do justice to the paper that you are um, reading or writing. Right now, we'll come to have a brief analysis of what is Australian literature in this unit. Actually, we're moving from 19th to 20th century poetry, and that is why in 20th century what we can see and what you can categorize as Australian literature must be clear in our mind. Uh, when Judith Wright uh, penned her poem Women to Men, she was not speaking as an Australian woman, but as one who shares with countless others the traits, apprehensions, and joys of being a woman. So, if you felt let down in certain ways, given the nature of our expectation of knowing Australian literature, um, you must see that, you must feel that, you must remember Judith Wright's saying that all literature expresses the culture, history, and literature of the or the contemporary period of that nation. So Australian literature is also not an exception. It gives us a kind of introduction or entry into that country in detail. So, the people of that country and the culture of that country, the place, the geographical location, all these things will give us a, a detailed account of the country. Even if you don't go there, you can know everything about that country, reading literature of Australia. So this should be clear in our mind. Then when we come to 20th century, so many changes have taken place in Australia, and the social picture, the contemporary life, the economic, political upheaval, all these things do contribute to the making of the literature of the nation. That is why we have to take up first the social picture. A great many changes took place in Australia between 1886 and 1904. The sharp division between the bush and the city cultures, the characters of two principal cities of Sydney and Melbourne. The former regarded as hearty and heartless, while the latter was hailed as consciously concise ridden. This is the difference between two cities: Sydney, heartless and hearty, and Melbourne, conscience ridden. Though this has been dismissed as a myth, some people reject this kind of distinction, and the capacity of Australians to discriminate. The Australian character is sometimes summed up in the difference between the two major cities, Sydney and Melbourne. Sydney, the original settlement, was overtaken in the 19th century by Melbourne, which became the nation's banking and mercantile capital. However, in the 20th century, Sydney has reclaimed supremacy, something often resented by Melbourne writers who see themselves as intellectuals arranged against Sydney's hedonists and stylists. Melbourne has had many schools of poetry, the most distinguished being that which was active at Melbourne University in the period between 1950s to the 1980s. The coincidence of universal education, the spirit of the nation, and the organization of labor had brought a new voice into literature that was earthy and realistic, democratic and optimistic. And it grew to a rapid consciousness of the world. Its optimism died out, but its other qualities survived in rather a different form. And to that, we can add the influence of two world wars and the great financial depression was another momentous period in the nation's history. Uh, the 1920s had seen years of rapid growth and the inflow of migrants, and the capital had been substantial. New industries were established, old ones expanded, thousands of men set themselves up as independent traders and artisans. Good seasons and prices raised farmers to high levels of optimism. And then came the crash, and by 1931, almost one third of the workforce was unemployed. The slow climb back as world markets recovered and local confidence was restored could not wholly erase the bitter aftertaste of the depression. Then the influence of World War II also changed Australia in many significant ways. The fall of Singapore and the Japanese drive uh, south destroyed the comfortable belief that the Royal Navy was sufficient to protect the Australian continent. Isolation, which 50 years earlier had been a safeguard, now became a threat, and the realization dawned that the future of Australia could never again be separated from that of Asia. Secondly, American cooperation with Australia during the war now led to increasing American cultural, political, and economic influences. American capital poured into the country and has been a major factor in post war Australian growth. Although Australian politics still followed the British model in foreign relations, it was increasingly influenced by the United States. Finally, Australian industrialization accelerated rapidly, and the war was followed by a period of great economic growth, a high inflow of capital from Japan as well, and of migrants predominantly from Northern Europe, and healthy export markets has made the society an affluent one. So when the economic condition is good, the literature of the country will also um, flourish by leaps and bounds. The development of Australian literature has been a slow and arduous process marked by conflict between the old convict legacy of Bush ballads, a colonial hangover, the self-conscious attempt at carving out a distinctively national literature, and uh, the growing awareness that to be truly effective, it must offer insights and values that are universal. Three broad phases may be distinguished in its pattern of development: the colonial period from the beginning to the late 19th century, the period of national independence from the 1890s to the World War I, and then from the 1920s to the present, in which both the colonial and national outlook alike have been absorbed into a more diverse uh, and balanced literary pattern. So all these three phases contributed to the development of Australian literature to a great extent. So here we will take the personal comment or personal lines concerned with the immediate realities of time and place. The most desolate of Australian poets was Christopher Bannon, and he writes, um, quote, "A bitter wind came out of the yellow pale waste, and my heart is shaken and filled with its triumphant cry. You will find neither home nor rest. For every forever you roam with the stars as they drift and the willful fades of the sky." This is the quotation is from the Wanderer, published in 1902. The strangeness of the new country, its inward flowing rivers, its monotony, its great deserts which were inhospitable to human habitation. Even at the end of the 20th century, the country supports a population of only 18 million people. The mixture of opposites, it is the smallest continent, but one of the greatest countries, largest countries, demanded a setting aside of previous associations and forging new bonds. Through 4 decades, from the foundation of the Commonwealth at the beginning of the current century to the outbreak of World War II, the way of these writers was not an easy one. They needed their own land, yet its intellectual and cultural atmosphere was too thin for sustenance. The cultivated minority with elevated taste, a lofty conception of writing, a severe standard of criticism, thinking, and conversation was disproportionately small. Australia had no culture. It was crude, materialistic. Many Australian writers sought inspiration from Europe and stayed there permanently, but most came back. The novelist Vance Palmer wrote, quote, "Art is really man's interpretations of the inner life of his surroundings, and until the Australian writer can tune his ear to catch the various undertones of our national life, our art must be false and unenduring." So Australian writers believed that they must write about their own nation culture in order to have a separate identity as Australian writers. See, the Australian writers need to come to the terms with the land which they called home and to derive inspiration from it without looking towards Europe all the time. Was exemplified in the verse of Judith Wright and Eddie Hope. These two are very prominent poets of Australian literature that we read frequently. They tried to maintain a balance between the colonial slavish attitude on the one hand and the aggressively artificial forced nationalism on the other. There is the acceptance of the country with all its alienness and hardships, and a plea to stop being second hand Europeans and evolve their own culture and tradition. Hope, along with James Macaulay, is known for his satires, while Wright is a powerful voice which seeks to draw attention to issues pertaining to women, their views and feelings ignored in the male dominated world. Women writers, until a decade or so earlier, were largely neglected. Lot, although there have been many whose works have been so good that their omission from the history of the mainstream of Australian literature is a reflection of the refusal to conform to the masculine image of the mainstream. Women writers project their own perception and point of view with regard to man, their attitudes and behavior, and frequently question stereotyped notions of these. Rosemary Dobson is a noted poet, translator, and critic who has been published extensively. She was a very popular poet. Now, another concept that we must deal with is the term uh, Jindi Warbucks. Okay? So Jindi Warbug is an Aboriginal word meaning to annex, to join, and the purpose of the movement was to free Australian art from the alien influences and chained it and that chained it and to bring it into proper contact with its material. Uh, Ingmels laid down his credo in the following terms. This movement was very important in the context of Australian literature, that we should remember clearly. So, this is about a clear recognition of the environmental values, the debunking of much nonsense, an understanding of Australian history and traditions, primeval, colonial, and modern. So, the new kind of art and literature should be based on these findings. They found a fitting symbol in the Aboriginal dream time of Alsira or Onsiringa, the myth of the the first time of creation itself, um, the root of all Aboriginal lore. In an attempt to break free of the circles of colonial thinking, as well as to counter the international influences that had breached Australia's isolation in the 1920s, the Jindi war books tried to force Australian literary development into narrow nationalistic channels. They saw Australia as the country untouched by white men. This movement is why important for all of us. They called this the real Australia and did not see that a railway train, a ship station, a windmill, or a city had become as much part of the natural background as quote unquote the haggard outback valleys, silent deserts, and straggly um, scrublands, unquote. They, they insisted on including Aboriginal words which were incomprehensible to the majority of the readers, and there was a forced and affected indigenous tone. The movement was symptomatic of a deeply felt need to perceive and express a sense of national identity and initially received much support. However, it faded. mm, it faded out because it was too backward and inward, looking too isolionist and parochial in nature. The winds of change that gusted in after World War II simply swept the naivety of the Jindi Warbox aside as of having no real relevance in the altered world situation. There are a couple of poems by Ingmels included in the here, which represent the basic principles of this movement. Before going to analyze it, there is one uh, thing that we must be clear. Mm. what Ingmels think about this movement. In 1940, a magazine which published the experimental work of many Australian and overseas poets was first brought out and was called the Angry Penguins. You must highlight this book called Angry Penguins. Some of those who had been associated with the earlier Dindi War book movement also appeared in this collection. There was an attempt to assert allegiance to the Australian landscape, often by the deliberate introduction of Aboriginal words and myths to achieve authenticity. Highly subjective imagery, obscure symbolism, etc., were regarded in high esteem. The journal was the victim of Australia's most celebrated literary hoax in 1944, known as the Orne Millie Affair. The hoax was brainchild of two poets, James Macaulay and Harold Stewart, who wanted to expose the false pretension of the people associated with the angry penguins. Now, these two movements apart, we see that how in 20th century literature of Australia has flowered and how its development was slow and steady. The literature of the country has flowered and it is possible to trace its development. Excuse. And so the convict legacy of the Booth's ballads and the early attempts to copy European uh, modes and follow their traditions, to the rise of national consciousness, its extremist form, as characterized by the Jindi war books and the subsequent mature writing, which maintains a balance between the two. There has also been a long due recognition of women writers and their concerns, as well as an expression of rights and the point of view of aborigines by those belonging to that disposed minority themselves. The passion and horror of war, the emotional torment of migration, the plight of disadvantaged groups such as the aborigines, the muted political and industrial conflict of the post-war years attracted many writers who worked from within the democratic tradition. However, they were criticized for clinging to tradition and for having lost the sense of forward movement. So, here we find that the indigenous movement was quite narrowly expressed. They were averse to any development, any new thing, but gradually these things also evaporated and will move to the second unit and how things in 20th century Australian poetry began and flowered, flourished, right? So this unit, the second unit, is the beginning of modern Australian poetry, and the grand old man of Australian poetry is will be introduced to this concept. A few years before the death of Brennan, a distinguished professor of English at Sydney, Professor John Lee A. Bertram, Brereton was a close friend of the poet who remarked that Brennan could have held any one of five chairs with the distinction at the university. The five chairs were those of philosophy, classics, French, German, and English. This will this can give us an idea and the range and the depth of its encyclopedic scholarship. Many critics have pointed out that in taste and influence, Brennan, 1870 to 1932, was fundamentally a 19th century poet, taken as the foremost Australian poet of the 20th century. His verse was written substantially in the 1919th. His poetry, though writers in Australia can only be understood in a European perspective. His first serious verse was written in 1891 under the influence of English poet Swinburne and as a personal response to the metaphysics of absolute propounded by Herbert Spencer and T.H. Green. Studying in Germany on a troubling scholarship in 1892 to 94, Brennan was influenced by French poetry of the later 19th century, especially by the works of Baudelaire, Riner, and Mallarmé. He found in their poetry a reflection of his own metaphysical search and became convinced that the single impulse behind all the writers of the symbolist and decadent schools was a search for a level of experience, some ideal of beauty that could not be found in ordinary life. From Mallarmé, he learned to focus his vague aspirations of ideal Eden. And after his meeting with Elizabeth Ferrer, later to become his wife, he sought to achieve this in human love. Brennan's first volume of poetry, uh, 21 poems, Towards the Source, it published in 1897, is the record of this endeavor. So, this is an essay in the La- Liber Compose, Liber Compose, the book of verse conceived and executed as a whole, a single concerted poem. In the course of the next 5 years, this primarily sequence, preliminary sequence was extended and then merged with a more ambitious cycle patterned on the symbolist pattern of Butler or Reader's work. In 1902, the cycle acquired another chapter, the series The Wanderer, in which the tensions of the previous chapters are triumphantly resolved. It ends on the note of conviction found in the attempt to achieve something, the attainment being a distant promise, and the wanderer repudiating the dream of the lost paradise, for the Miltonic conception of the paradise within us. Completed by 1902 but published more than a decade later, the cycle belongs to the poetry of 1890s. Brennan acclimatized the symbolist liber compose in Australian verse and extended the frontiers of Australian poetry. So he could be regarded as the father of Australian poetry or grand old man of Australian poetry. Poetry of Brennan was that which mediated between the two lives of man, the outer weariness which made Baudelaire a maniac, and the hours of insight. The symbol would be the mediator between appearances and underlying truth, the two lives, the real and the ideal, and their constant opposition and interaction from the great subject that occupies Brennan in almost all his poetry. Brennan rejected intellectual analysis and was in favor of symbolism, which he equated with poetry. He emphasized the role of the imagination and not the intellect in the task of humanizing the universe and uniting soul and matter, man and his or her world. But when it came to actual practice, he chose the intellectual and the literary symbol, not the real facts of the real world. He preferred a generalized concept to an actually seen thing. For him, a rose is a spiritual and not an earthly flower. So, this is the symbolistic mode that we come across in the early 20th century in Brennan's poetry. So then the poem, Each Day I See the Long Ships Coming into Port, is a very important poem by Brennan, where the poet watches huge ships coming into the harbor and crowding the rails are people eager to have a glimpse of land after being tossed around on the sea for months at a time. To the travelers, it does not matter that they have come to an alien land, one that will require a great deal of adaptations before it will finally seem home to them. The monotonous song of the seas and the force of winds have swept away all fears and rancor, so that any land is seen as welcome. After all those months of isolation, cut off from the daily commerce of the world, not to have known of anything in any crowded way, the prospect of once more walking on farmland and coming into contact with other human beings is a thrilling one. Although they may have their native land filled with anger, disgust, or disappointment at their fellow humans' uh, behavior. The sea and the wind together have swept clean all those negative feelings, and they are once more eager to take up life from where they had left off. In this sense, it is an acknowledgement of the power of nature to soothe, to repair, and to rejuvenate our spirit so that all bitterness is washed away and we are ready to face the trials of the world with a renewed faith. It also attests to the force of the human desire to seek companionship and the need to trust others even if one has suffered betrayals or losses. Man never gives up hope, no matter what he has experienced. At every turn, he feels a thrill of expectation course through him and hope that there are good things in store for him in the future. And a man, therefore, can never give up struggle or fight. The short poem is reminiscent of the romantic tradition in which the poet starts off with a description of a general scene and then gradually relates to his own subjective experience, making it a part of his immediate reality. Then you come to the next poem, The Native Singer, which is by John Sar Nelson, born 1872 and died 1942. For the kind of life he led, we would expect his poetry to be of distinctly national flavor and tint, full of the scenes, people, and life around him. However, In reality, there is a hardly a poem of his which is recognizably Australian. His description of places or events are such that it is possible to place them anywhere in the English-speaking world because his poetry is so distinctive and, in a sense, so unlikely a product of his surroundings and education. It has the appearance of what can be found called pure inspiration. So Nilsson belonged to a selector's family which lived and struggled for 30 or more years in a semi-arid and monotonous bushland. Life was full of grinding poverty, continuous labor, disasters, and disappointments. Finally, forced off the land, Nielsen spent most of the rest of his life as a casual laborer on farms, railways, coal mines, grape picking, ditch digging, and as a quarry worker. When he was past 50, some friends got him a job as a messenger in a government department. It was well meant, but the hours were long and city life did not suit him, and he almost stopped writing. By this time, he published several books of poems, but he remained very much alone. Although um, some literary people corresponded with him and helped him, he spent almost the whole of his life in surroundings where no one knew or cared about poetry. When he once requested a fellow laborer to take down a poem as he dictated it, his eyes were too bad for him to do his own writing. His mate was full of amazement, asking him, "Yeah, but what is it? But what is it for? Yeah, but what do you want to do it for?" And finally, but this isn't poetry anyway. Joke, you must be going off your onion. The final remark is particularly interesting. Poetry that is made to have recognized as poetry would probably have been a bush ballad, but Nielsen was writing something delicate, cultivated, and highly civilized, similar to classical compositions like symphonies and sonatas in music, and totally um, incomprehensible um, to the people he was surrounded with, as would have been classical music. And this is Nilsson Ross, and how he is very sophisticated and obscure. We will know from the things. Uh, we can have some quotations or some lines for proof. Nilsson had a high notion of poetry and believed sincerely in its basic function. Uh, quote, "Good brothers of the song, be not too humble. It is you and I, a few others, lived the world alone." His poetry was always the most important factor in his life, although his circumstances prevented him from sparing it much time. His hard life and poor eyesight meant that a great deal of his work was lost due to the lack of leisure or people to write it down for him. These factors also influenced the kind of poetry he wrote. He had to confine himself to the simpler rhythms so that he could remember them easily, since much of his verse was composed and carried around him in his head till he got the opportunity to put it down on paper. He was an uneven writer who never fully smoothed the roughness from his poetry. He has a core of incadence which allies him to the tradition of William Blake and the English mystics. His color perception are consistent throughout his poetry. Green is for him the color of youth and spring. Violet is the color of death and of the ground. And red stands for strength and violence. White for innocence and childhood, and so on. He fuses other perceptions and ideas in striking ways. The silence only wet, the morning was too loud with the light, the tremble of the hollow ear. I saw the mushrooms hopping. His poetry was never very popular. It ignores the sentiments and absorption and politics of the time and the place. And this may well prove to be its strength rather than weakness. His poetry has frequently been dismissed as weak and feminine by critics immersed in the Australian cult of manliness and toughness. However, the best present day poets have begun to adopt an unself-conscious attitude towards the um, country, which Nielsen was one of the first to do. The poetry springs from the soil to speak instead of being applied to it artificially, like some strange cultural manure. Nielsen is a remarkable phenomenon, a minor but genuine and gifted poet who is distinctly individual and not afraid to be universal. The qualities which make his work one of lasting value. Uh, he was not popular during his time, but in modern times or at present times, his poetry is quite popular. And then we will have to analyze another poem, The Orange Tree, uh, by Nelson. And the poem will detect nothing that suggests an Australian orange orchard, yet it is this in this which gave Nilsson the idea of the poem when he was working at Melbourne in Victoria. In Nilsson's own words, quote, I think it was just after I gave up the horse driving job that I did a little bidding amongst the oranges for a few days. It was then that I was struck with a very beautiful light there in May in northern Victoria, the dark green of the orange trees and the beautiful sunlight gave them enchantment hard to describe. It was there that I got the main idea of the orange tree. Nielsen had a perfectly definite Australian scene in mind, but the poem may have been written in any part of the world where oranges grow. What he gives you is not the external details of the experiences, but the essence of it. It is the orange tree transplanted into the internal landscape of the imagination, where it links up with things not to be found in the external landscape of northern Victoria at all. Nelson made another comment regarding this poem. Quote, I have said before that I got some of the ideas when I was bidding oranges at Melbourne. There was also something which I tried to drag in, some enchantment or other. I cannot well describe it. I have seen um, Botticelli's wonderful picture, Spring. I think that I think that is the name. It has lovers, it has maidens, and greenery, and I think a robber in the background. Of course, I know nothing about art at all, but anything Botticelli's I see fills me with emotion. Prints of other great pictures leave me cold. So here we come to know about Nilsson's ideas or his experiences as a laborer, as a horse guider, or in the field, has have some direct influence upon him as a poet. And when you look at the structure of the poem, out of 10 stanzas, the first is balanced between the two voices, two lines for the man, two for the girl. Then every two stanzas devoted to the man's questions are counterpointed by a statement made by the girl, who also speaks the final lines, thus having the last word. The first stanza describes the physical position of the two speakers who are some standing side by side in front of the orange tree. The girl is captivated and speaks the first words, almost unaware of what she does. The man seems not to understand what she means. In the entire poem, there appears to be a dialogue, but no real communication between the man and the young girl. So this is uh, Brennan and Nielsen for all Oz. When we look at them, we find that neither Brennan nor Nielsen wrote recognizably in Australian poetry. In addition, neither were widely read in their day. However, the chief hope of poetry as such at the beginning of the 1920s lay in the sweeping vision Brennan had achieved and the lyricism of Nielsen. While the former was influenced by Western thought and philosophy, especially the symbolist movement, the latter, with hardly any education or reading worth the name, wrote out of an innate gift. Both of them ignored their contemporary preoccupations and wrote poetry which, though not offering an immediacy of experience, offers universal insights not bound by time or place. Each day I see expresses the unquenchable thirst of the human spirit for peace world, while the orange trees speak of the other thirst of the human spirit, the quest for the sublimity of spiritual experience which transcends the mundane and ordinary facts of existence. Now, this can tell us what we are doing, and with this, we can move to the third unit, which tells us about the notion of modern Australia. Here we have words like um, R.D. Fitzgerald, whose poems, This Night's Orbit, we will read in some detail. And the father of modern Australian poetry, or the tag, or yeah, goes to this poem, and which in the it is in this period from the end of the World War to the present that Australian literature has really attained maturity. It is a maturity attested by the emergence of fresh talent, the range and variety of literary output, and by the greater degree of sophistication and accomplishment to be found not only in creative writing itself, but also in the criticism. In the period between the publication of Thief of the Moon and Five Wells, also by Slisser, whom we will read in the next unit or here, Australian verse can be seen as gradually becoming contemporary in tone, attitude, and technique, in the sharpness of image and occasional cynicism, in its adjustment to the atmosphere of the city and the ability to even find beauty in city life. When we talk about influences on modern Australian poets, one name that comes to our mind very often is Norman Lindsay, who in his lifetime was a figure of controversy and adulation. A cartoonist, painter, novelist, and author of one of Australia's classic children's stories, he very early laid down his philosophy and values to which he remained constant throughout his long life. The vitalism and gaiety which understood his controversial paintings were too attractive to be ignored by the upcoming creative people of the day. Lindsay himself consciously expounded this vitalism as a philosophy. The immediately positive effects of Lindsay's vitalist ideas upon the poets was um, to stimulate a delight in a clear, colorful surface, detail, and a celebration of the overwhelming vitality of masculine life force. A poet, as a young man, had come under the influence of the Norman Lindsay circle, whose name is Kenneth Slessor, and he was born in the year 1901 and died in 1971. He was one of Lindsay's earliest followers, and in many of his attitudes and beliefs remained constant to the master. Lindsay's position was elaborately anti-materialistic, an attitude that is appealing to the idealistic young people of any generation, and his demonstration of gaiety and vitalism was glamorous and intoxicating. Also, this promise of rekindling the classic culture of Australia after snatching it away from decadent Europe and lost to America was tempting as Australians were only too painfully aware of the lack of cultural traditions in their own country. Slasher may be called the father of the modern Australian poetry and is the most important poet in Australian history after Jones Nilsson. His most active writing uh, active writing life occurred between the late 1920s and the end of the World War II. Once he had shaken off Lindsay's influence on his style, Slasher began to write the earliest poetry in the country that showed the influence of European and American contemporaries, especially T.S. Eliot. Slasher has a more claim at being a more true national poet than any other outback writer. His masterpiece is Five Bells, a lament for a dead friend that portrays Sydney and its a harbor from the time of the early settlement to the modern city of Sobats and naval destroyers. Slusser's sense of history pervades his vision of the present day and is displayed in poems of past hardship and cruelty, such as in Vesper, songs of the Reverend Samuel Marsden. Then we come to the poem South Country, uh, and here Cesar, a loving citizen of Sydney, was not really given to writing about Australian country scenes. But South Country is one poem which deals with the Australian landscape. This poem shows something of a quality very visible in his poetry, a physical rather than a sensual imagination, a sense of objective things vividly present, but not deeply imagined in feeling. It is a quality not only found in the images he gives uh, odds, but in the obvious need to give in sound, texture, and rhythm, and the rub and the bruise of solids that are in contact with us. Even the thunderstorm is a place and stresses a fondness for the echoing of a vowel and consonantal sounds within rather abrupt rhythms emphasizes the sense of physics. The senses of touch and sight are evoked repeatedly throughout the poem, whether it be in the dealing of detailing of the landscape, the quality of light, uh, or the approaching storm. The vegetation is pale and characterless, with no distinguishing landmarks to set the miles apart. There is only bare-faced anonymity, the monotony of which grades on the imagination. There is an ascribing human qualities to these trees as though they have finally reached an end to their arguments, doubts, and quarreling, plots and pains, and have flattened out in clear distances like an abrupt solution. The flat earth of empty palms is symbolic of the void that is so essentially a part of Schleier's work, is a recognition of emptiness that lurks in a spiritually depleted world. In continuation of the idea, the color of the sunlight is depicted as tainted. It is no longer bright and unclouded, but is rotting, for it has been tinged by the hue of the imminent storm with its black bruised face. The fourth stanza is vividly physical. The huge pressure of air pounding the bony reeds, the spine of the earth, its mountains, as it were, is vibrant with sexual imagery, which, combined with the reference to drains of light, is suggestive of new life and beginnings. The storm clouds have passed and out of the blackness. Three, their pours forth a luminous ray of light which erases the horizon and obliterates the demarcation between sky and earth so that one seems to be walking on the sky's bench. The dwindled hills are implicative of the conscience of the land which has rounded and flattened the contours of the elevated areas over centuries of wind and rain. The little bulges seem to have forced their way up from under the earth, like skulls seeking air in a spirit of rebellion, refusing to give up, and just another smothered to death. The Australian spirit of determination is evoked in this image, giving rise, as it does, to the picture of a frail, fragile life, unwilling to give up the fight against the harshness of the land and the work of the gods. So this is the poem for all of us, and with that, we will come to the next important poet, Hardy Fitzgerald. The influence of Norman Lindsay was not confined to Schleyer. Robert D. Fitzgerald, who was born in 1902 and died in 1971, is the only other Australian poet of stature in the 1930s, was another disciple, and when Douglas Stewart took up the position of literary editor of the Sydney Bulletin, He helped to extend the basic tenets of the vitalist philosophy. There was no exhibition of romantic swagger or heroic self consciousness. There was an emphasis on action rather than intellect, on the physical rather than the emotional, a rejection of subtleties of thought and feeling, a tendency towards statement rather than suggestion, a certain lostness of imagery and perception. These traces can still be found in the writing of certain writers. Fitzgerald's early work displayed an attachment to the Indasian fantasy, a phase which he soon left behind. The publication of his collection of poems, Moonlight Acre, established him as a poet of comparable stature as his friend Kenneth Slessor. Fitzgerald's voice is different from Caesar's, being more stocky and physical in a firm but not sensuous way. His graph containment within the experienced world, it is enough that trees are trees, the earth is the earth, and stone is a stone, opens up possibilities for the imagination. There is a reflection of Brennan's resolute, densely textured style in Fitzgerald's manner. He is a slow-moving and philosophical poet. In a sense, Fitzgerald is what 20th century poetry, uh, a mix-up from Brennan to Lindsay to Slessor. All these things, all these creams of poetry are mixed in Fitzgerald's poetry. While Slessor seemed to be in danger of withdrawing from reality, Fitzgerald's attitude is threatened by complacency. His later work was a continual effort towards growth, leading to achievement with the boundaries of sustained determinist philosophy. His great achievement was to capture and compress a sense of historical presence in a world ridden with inherited guilt, the unyielding boundaries of events throw the poet back to the most fruitful of sources, man caught in action and its interchange. So, the poem This Night's Orbit by Fitzgerald is very interesting, and as the title of the poem suggests, that the sense of inexorable movement of time, the- referring to the orbit, the feeling of continuity as expressed in a cycle of the orbit of the planets is very much present. The orbit moves in a circle where there is no beginning and no end. The revolution and rotation of the orbs is a sign of the universal order, and the night's orbit indicates the passing of many such nights, while at the same time presaging the approach of many more. Human life is also dictated by the sequence of night and day and is thus of necessity bound to the universal pattern and rhythm, while the waxing and waning of the moon has its counterpart in phases of mortal life and existence. While the poet walks back and forth on the moonlit grass outside his house, he is reminded of the other times that he has done so, and he recognizes that those moments have vanished into the past, never to return, and that this is a natural occurrence. If this were not the case, he would not be bound in this night's orbit or the moon's. Being a mortal, he has to accept the time. He has to accept that time drifts away inevitably. Sometimes even one's memories dim and one is left only with hazy remembrances. But there will be other nights and days in the cycle of life, bound as we are to the night's orbit and the moon's. The past is always with him at every turn of the road. Old sins are blown like a sand across the hillocks as he revolves memories around his head. The present would not be what it is if it were not for the past, and sometimes it is tempting to let go of the present and evade its responsibilities by escaping into the bylanes of the memory, to allow one's head to bury in the past. But then the poet expresses his determination to meet, quote unquote, the fresh hour as he has always done. The past, precious as it is, may be, is not to be sacrificed at the altar of regret or fond recollections. There is there is the acceptance of the trend, acceptance of the need to get on with life, a, a rebuttal of Shelley's lament that we look before and after and pine for what is not. So let us sum up the modern Australian poet in this way. The land becomes a natural subject for an Australian poet. The discovery of the South land, the significance of that discovery, and hence of modern Australia in the history of the human spirit. Slasher and Fitzgerald, both influenced in individual ways by Lindsay's vitalist philosophy. This must be underlined. This vitalist philosophy, where man is important, his work is important, and where things out of control do not take place, where reality is important to imagination. Uh, this is the vitalist philosophy advocated by Lindsay, and it is made strong statements about the nature of human existence. South Country, the poem is a passionately written poem which brings out the ironic mindset of the Australian spirit. It speaks of the isolation of the continent and of what it means to be a poet there, far from the happening centers of art, culture, and philosophy. This night's orbit is a more personal poem, meandering through the corridors of the poet's memory as he contemplates his past and future and revolves memories in his mind, seeking to relate them to his growth as a human being. Now, let us come to the fourth unit where we find uh, some interesting poems by Judith Wright and David Campbell and other important poets, and who continued the tradition or trend uh, created by Lindsay and his followers. Judith Wright, born 1915, published her first bulletin poem and was immediately hailed as a powerful new voice. The first impression did not prove illusory, and the feeling that here was a great talent buzzing with brilliance was proved when a number of poems appeared in rapid succession the same year. Those poems have now become a part of the accepted heritage of Australian verse. Her past collection, The Moving Image, published in 1946, was seen as a landmark in which the shorter lyrics explored the landscape and inheritance in spirit of restless inquiry, merged with apparently effortless mastery over technique. The second collection was Women to Men, Woman to Man, 19, published in 1949, and it consolidated her position on the poetic firmament. Her preoccupations with the concept of time led her to deeper, more abstract questions to the idea of nothingness itself. The question of man bereft of Godhead became one of her central concerns. However, the nothing apprehended in her work does not possess the quality of a cold panic that underlies Slasher's poetry. Despite her constant circling around the theme of mankind's place and purpose in the universe, there is an implicit earth assurance, the deep knowledge that nothing is only flux, the continuous flow and the change in existence. A sense of nothingness pervades Judith Rice's poetry. Uh, Let us discuss the poem Legend. The poem has a almost a fairy tale like quality about it. One grows up reading stories of a brave young man who, overcoming all manner of dangers, are finally crowned with incredible success and riches. Legend talks about the pioneering spirit of the settlers of Australia who were full of the spirit of adventure and are willing to risk their lives for a dream. They had a confidence in their ability to conquer all obstacles in their path to attain their objective, and the poem is a paean to the vibrant spirit of the founding fathers of modern Australia. The very first words, quote unquote, the blacksmith's boy, sets the tone. This is not a poem about people of noble birth or those born into the aristocratic fold with all its accompanying comforts and advantages. It is a story of a poor blacksmith boy, a member of the laboring class, who sets out on his quest with a rifle, even that breaks up later, and a dog. The poem is placed in an egalitarian society and projects Australia as the land of opportunity and ready to reward those who have the heart to toil and the determination to succeed. The cobwebs of routine and tradition, the temptations of the creature of comforts of a settled, secure life, cling to his feet and try to hamper his sinking steps. Likewise, the land poses its own difficulties. Quote unquote rivers hindered him. Thorn branches caught at his eyes to make him blind, and the sky turns to an ominous hue, portending a violent storm. But he didn't mind. This is an optimistic understatement with the lines that follow, reflecting the dogged intention, die-hard spirit, and stout-heartedness of the boy. The second stanza delineates the physical adversities that beleaguer him, appearing suddenly as if from nowhere, while the voice of convention discourages his adventurous spirit, crying, "You will soon be dead." But nothing deters him, and he continues on his way in spite of the heavy rain which falls upon him in sheets like a mat of hair. Soon night falls, and the blackness of oblivion and failure is ready to swallow him up. A gentle, faint-hearted creatures wail while the grass gets ready to receive his body. Everything fails him. His rifle breaks, his head blows away, and even his faithful companion, the dog, deserts him. But not for him. the pliant acceptance of a malignant fate, for he is willing to risk all in order to realize his vision. And this is the indomitable spirit of the mm, man, the protagonist, who belongs to a labor class. Then we come to the next poem, the Bullocky, and the poem depicts the hard, back-breaking drudgery of early settlers, the hard-working toilers of the field, who, in tandem with their strong beasts of burden, worked doggedly throughout the year in all vagaries of the weather to make the land fertile. Time passes quickly as the bullocky laborers labors without any human company, only his strong team of bullocks working shoulder to shoulder with him until finally the striding years take their toll and time runs wilder scenes in the brain. Involved in his back-breaking labor day in and day out, he loses track of time, which suddenly seems to start moving in the opposite direction, so that he retreats into the mythical past. With no one to share his tedious hours, there is a detachment from reality, and a madness of a sort sets in as he begins to see fiends and angels, finds and angels using his road. There is a recognition that a land grows fruitful through the labor of its uneducated working class, and not its aristocracy, and then they should be given due credit. In doing so, the Bullocky assumes a larger than life dimension and passes into the realm of myth and the Australian legend. He is Moses, and there is the identification of Australian tradition with the pre-Christian and Christian traditions, sanctified by age and the transfer of legend into myth. A new dimension of continuity has added to the uniqueness. This too is a part of the process of identification. This redefinition of the Australian symbols of discoverer, the pioneer, the bushman in terms of every man. They never say die. Spirit of the pioneers is epitomized in the image of the bullocky, metamorphosing into Moses, the slaves, his suffering and stubborn team. And at the end of this his day of labor, the bullocky fills the half lighted funnel of the day with his prophecies, the future thus being inextricably linked with the past and the present. The quote unquote half light pillars reinforce the dreamlike quality of the situation, while the quote unquote stippled cone of night with its evocation of a torch stipple in combination with Moses and his prophecies underlines the spiritual connotations. So this tells us how early Australian 20th modern poetry is being composed, and how themes were undertaken, and how the reality of life has surfaced instead of the sheer imagination of 19th century poet. Then we come to the next important poet, David Campbell, brought up on the family ship station in New South Wales, Campbell, 1915 to 1979, went to Cambridge University, where he developed a love for poetry. Returning to Australia, he worked as a jacquero before serving with the Royal Australian Air Force during World War II. After the war, Campbell lived on various stations in Canberra area, dividing his lifetime between farming and poetry. His first volume, Speak with the Sun, appeared in 1949. Its tone is predominantly Australian, with poems about the landscape, life in the bush, and Aboriginal themes. The collection also includes the memorable war poem, quote unquote, Man in Green. Among Campbell's other collections are The Miracle of Mullion Hill, 1956, Poems, 1962, The Branch of Dodona, 1970, Devil's Rock, 1974, and The Man in the Honeysuckle, 1979, were quite famous. And in 1964, Campbell was appointed poetry editor of the Australian. He received numerous awards for his poetry. He has also produced two collections of short stories and, with Rosemary Dobson, published translations of Russian poetry. Uh, so his poem, The Australian Dream, is written in an anecdotal style with a regular rhyme scheme which goes like this A, B, B, C, C, and so on. The first stanza has a felicity of expression that immediately grabs the reader's attention. The poet's head is quote unquote bronze with claret. Then he is suddenly woken up at 3 in the morning, for after having imbibed freely the previous night, his mind is still foggy and blurred with the effects of the alcohol. Light blinded the stairs in a vivid metaphor as he stumbles down to the door and the quote unquote the hastened sprang upright, assuming substance and shape once it is illuminated, springing up from out of the darkness that surrounds it. And finally, once he manages to open the door, um, what would what should he find there but the royal family with a babbling torch? The unsteady and dim light of the torch is in ironic contrast to the imperial brightness of the sun that never set on the British Empire in bygone times. The queen proceeds to apologize for the intrusion of and explains why they are at all. The pubs were full, most of our subjects rude. It seems the queen's command brings only, quote unquote, tell the dead Marines. There is a questioning of tradition and blind loyalty to the Queen, and an expression of resentment against the participation of Australia in the war at Britain's bidding, with the consequent high number of casualties. There is also the implicit notion that respect and awe cannot be endangered purely through status or taken for granted over succeeding generations, but must be honored through one's life and actions. There is a movement towards a more democratic world in which everything or everyone is equal and respected for all their qualities of mind, heart, and intellect. And this unit tells us about how the modern poetry of Australia is in safe hands now. Uh, when we see that after the early work shaped by personal experience, first of a recovered childhood and ancestral past, and then fulfillment in love, right? Without losing her sense of place, and identity became increasingly concerned with philosophical issues. Time becomes a central preoccupation. There is also another voice that of protest against the destructiveness of man and his inhumanities. Legend depicts the struggle of the early settlers in a high-hearted manner, which belies the intensity of the purpose underlying it, that of unveiling the determination and hard work that went into the making of the Australian legend. Bullocky, with its vivid evocation of the promised land, displays her concentrated powers of suggestion. Moving away from his early focus on nature, Campbell remolded his poetic temperament and perspective to focus on contemporary issues. His essential lyricism still persists even uh, in his later work, where it is combined with a more universal tone. The Australian Dream brings out Campbell's egalitarian attitude in incorporating within its fold an ironic, hard-hitting critique of the Queen, which is characteristic of the Romantics' general disapprobation of institutions and symbols of authority. This is also concomitant with the Australian national ethos, their profound dislike for the Queen, which can be traced in as far back as Lawson's The English Queen. Now, with this, we will move to the next unit, and which is about the coming of age of Australian poetry in its present form, and writers like Eddie Hope, James Macaulay, and uh, Eddie Hope's poems, Australia, Moscow's Mustiperos, all these poems will take up in this unit. And James Macaulay, 1917 to 1976, apart from his complicity in the Ern Melly hoax, had at that time published only two volumes of verse under Aldebaran 1946 and A Vision of Ceremony 1956, while the first of these showed traces of a writer toying with the idea of a type of modernism which he was related to parody. It ends with the long formal satire. This second collection, in spite of having some exquisite lyrics, was practically insulated in its remoteness and coolness of tone. Macaulay was a brilliant and tortured intellectual, lapsed into political and religious reaction, emerging only at the end of his life as a lyrical and elegiac writer. His was, his was an inhibiting influence, though in a period of reaction against excess, his cool formalism offered something of poise and certainty to cling on to, a means of incantation against the terrible unleashed holocaust of the war and the atom bomb. His own preoccupation in life and art seemed to be a unified worldview, a soaring ardor of heroic self dedication, and an opportunity of producing significant social results. His deep awareness of the spiritual tradition and the spiritual malaise of the West was found not in Europe but in the jungles of the New Guinea in the years during and immediately after the war. His early poetic thought was nourished by a vision of the cyclical upheaval and stagnation of society, and a concern for the revolutionary role of the poet. The aesthetic theory asserts the visionary and intuitive nature of poetry and speaks of the craft of the poet as a mystery requiring self dedication, which is ratified by the exceptional experiences. Yet, He sees the vital shape of poetry as flowering from the traditional values of Western society. His political concern is with the organic life of society, just as in poetry, despite a sense of deepening despair, he is concerned with the unity of the human personality in a world which is seen to have essentially metaphysical significance. As a literary figure, his influence in Australia is considerable. Now, his Terra Australis, the poem speaks of Australia as a place of myth, a country of the mind, to use a phrase from Patrick White's verse. It conjures of Australia's of fables and dreams, the unexplored continent, the yearn for destination of intrepid explorers in days gone by. It is not a physical experienced reality, but an imagined land which exists in Queer's vision is Hidalgo heart. In order to reach this southern continent, one needs to voyage within oneself on the fabled ocean of fantasy and dream as Queers and others of his ilk did. Then we come to quickly come to Eddie Hope, born in uh, Kuma, the South Wales, New South Wales. Pope, 1907 to 2000, studied languages and literature at Sydney and Oxford universities. Returning to Australia, he taught at Sydney's Teachers College, the Melbourne University, and in 1951 was appointed Foundation Professor of English at the Australian National University in Canberra. He retired from his position in 1968 to concentrate on writing poetry. Hope's first collection of verse, The Wandering Island, appeared in 1955. Others followed, including poems 1960, A Late Picking 1975, The Drifting Continent 1979, Ladies from the Sea 1987, and Orpheus 1991. Though his poetry, Through his poetry, which characteristically uses traditional rhythms and forms, he comments on contemporary values and seeks to provide insights into human experience. Acknowledged as one of the Australia's leading poets, his work is acclaimed internationally. In addition to poetry, Pope has also written critical studies on aspects of Australian literature. He was made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 1981. When you come to Eddie Hope's poem Australia, the poem is a traditional homecoming poem with the point of view presented at the beginning of a remnant of someone returning home but seeing his country from the outside, as if for the first time after a long absence. It is necessary to keep this in mind if one is to understand the apparent change in the last two stanzas. It takes as its theme the idea of Australia's qualities as a nation. This is very important. The idea of Australia's quality as a nation. The description maps the geographical and physical aspects of the country as well as its psychological territory. The poem begins in a disenchanted, saddening but completely accurate observation, a notion of drab green and desolate grey. There is a deliberate downplaying of natural beauty, and the landscape emerges in muted tones of grey and green. Hope evokes the monotonous color, the flatness, the sense of age and attrition. There is a direct comparison to the colors of any army uniforms, an image replete with the suggestions of horror, waste, and destruction. This is further reinforced from when he compares it with the sphinx. There is no idea here of vitality or growth, but only a stark picture of desolation and emptiness. It is a country as inscrutable as the spinach, characterized by characterized not by the vivacity and spirit of its people, but by the flora that darkens her hills. They call her a young country, but they lie, quote unquote. He states unequivocally, geographically, and geographically it is one of the oldest lands, but it is known as a young country because it has only recently been brought under the civilized white domination. Then we come to the next point. We have to sum up quickly. Moscow's um, Mus- Pharaohs is the second poem of importance. This is a poem set in India against the backdrop of the jungles of Assam. The Kasturi deer, hunted unrelentingly for the musk it carries within its body, is the leitmotif of the poem. In an entrancingly vivid description, the poet unravels the process whereby hunters use music for perverse ends, to lure the deer within the range of deadly poisoned arrows. The lines which describe the music resoundingly through the woods are exquisite in their evocativeness. A tremulous skein of melody wavers, now dancing, now a rain of pure bright drops of sound. Hope makes the most effective use of language to convey the passionate intensity of the music, which heightens the horror of the indiscriminate massacre. The silvery notes of the flute dripped, soaking through the gloom of the forest, spending antising tentacles into its depth, till the deer, forgetting fear and with its soul acute, with the melody, step into the clearing where the predators are waiting with the infinite patience. So, this tells us about Pope's concern with India and the Kosari deal. Then, to sum up, Terra Australis insists upon Australia as a place in myth, as having its existence in imagined constructions, quote unquote, a country of the mind. But the poem also makes it clear that the nature of that country may vary according to the ideological predisposition of the writer. So, it may be a land which reflects the egalitarian Australian legend, one which is modeled on a gloomy metaphysical conviction of alienation and exile, or one which is the natural site for the isolated romantic hero. In each case, the land, topographical and intellectual, seems to make available an appropriate metaphor for the preferred ideology. Pope, in his finest poetry, aims to strike at the core of human experience without raising the question of a national identity at all. And what he celebrates is a radically human aspiration. Australia expresses a romantic desire for the spiritual purity of the desert landscapes where hope locates, quote unquote, some spirit which escapes the legend learned doubt. He defines his Australia in terms of what it does not have and attempts to recuperate these deficiencies and see them as offering a distinctive site for somehow purer human experience. Now, with this, we come to Moscow's Mosiferos, a prayer of report to Saint Cecilia. about the way of the power of music is being misused is one of Hope's most perfect and serene pieces. It is a poem of protest, a conservationist plea to save from extinction the mosquitoes that are killed in horrific numbers by the perfume industry. The protest is delivered with all the resources of art and is a delicate issue of language and sound. Now, with this, we'll come to our last unit, which is exclusively about women's poetry, the marginalized voice, and how women like Rosemary Dobson and Kate Walker have continued the Aboriginal tradition, and the margin has barged into the central space through their poetry. Women's writing has a pertinence and a force for a variety of reasons. While projecting the observations, situations, responses, and struggles of the female half of the humanity, it also reflects a consciousness and created consciousness created by gender, the entity traditionally defined by the frameworks of kinship, marriage, and procreation. At another level, it questions values and constructs considered self-evident so far. It focuses attention on the definition of freedom and creativity and raises a number of queries related to oppression and colonization. It has helped both to put together and express the idea of the female self as well as the dismantle the concept of a all pervasive male figure working through the revolutionary movements as well as the silent changes through legal political battles and by breaching psychological barriers. Women are beginning to know and discover themselves. All women's writing is not feminist, and even when gender identification overrides cultural barriers, certain cultural concepts are also define and differentiate feminist positions. Feminist interpretations, however, can flow out even though absence and denial and are not necessarily dependent on equivalence and identification. Many women writers are wary of their feminist affiliations even today for fear of being further marginalized, as the feminist is not juxtaposed with the masculine but is regarded as a subculture and the voice and the class of victim and the oppressed thrust upon it. Then we come to Rosemary Dobson, whose whose poem Cock Crow is very important for our discussion. And the poem Crow gives expression to a woman's wish to be herself, freed of all social roles of mother, daughter, wife, etc., wanting to be alone. The poet walks the road between the town and a lit up house. To and fro, she strides 3 times while thoughts pummel her and she experiences a riot of feelings. She is adrift from the normal course of her routine, closed and around by the dark trees on the lonely stretch of road, and gradually feels herself absolved of her bonds until it seems as though she is suddenly light, freed from early ties, the only thing holding her being her feet on the ground. Then we have the Aboriginal voice, uh, another indigenous poem. The indigenous colonized population, the Aborigines, had a rich oral culture that was not translated into written form until the 20th century and has still made only a slight impact on the written literature of the country. The growth of specifically Aboriginal literature in English has been slow and remains slight. The poets uh, Udiro, Nonokul, formerly Keith Walker, um, Mudro, Colin Johnson, and Lionel Fogarty have all published widely and achieved recognition. The chief repository of Aboriginal culture is in translation by anthropologists and scholars of ritual ceremonies among tribesmen. In spite of the existence of the rich oral culture, it is only in the 1960s that the first Aboriginal writing was accessible to an English speaking audience. Okay. Then we come to Kathuakar. Kathuakar, born 1920, belongs to the Aboriginal world by birth and upbringing, but civilization was forced on her a course on the flora, fauna, and landscape of her childhood. Strandbrook, the backdrop of her early years, was once stocked with natural beauty, and she lived there with her family, birds, beasts, and trees. Several laws implicit in the Aboriginal ways of life bound man, animal, and nature together. For instance, an Aboriginal rule laid down that one can kill while hunting, only to eat and not for sport. This ensured the survival of the beasts and protected them from indeterminate slaughter. Aboriginal life was perfectly ordered and complete in itself. Into this closed road of unseen bones, the white man made inroads, and Aboriginal life slowly but surely got infected by alien ways, including the white man's system of education. Uh, her poem, We Are Going, discusses the agony of disposition. The first five lines depict the contrast between the decimated indigenous people and the invaders who have proliferated the direct proportion or to the indirect proportion to the dwindling numbers of the aborigines. They are subdued and silent, pitifully small group of survivors, while the whites can be seen hurrying about like ants. Their semi-naked state is symbolic of their situation, for they are neither totally natural as they used to be in the earlier times, nor have they been completely assimilated into the white man's world and customs. Uh, so the women's writing mm, reflects an engagement with social and political issues with theoretical perspectives and moves outside cultural and disciplinary boundaries. The act of writing has helped them to move outside the narrow rule and the man's helpmate um, outside the role of seductress, the angel or the witch. It helps problematize the areas of conflict and facilitates a source for alternative models as they deconstruct literary forms and socio-political structures. Rosemary Dobson's poetry reflects the women's point of view, presenting a world that is minefield of emotions, where the women's need to express her individuality is suffused with guilt. The only human inhabitants of the country when the white settlers arrived there were the aborigines, who were bound to the land that was taken from them by the indissoluble link of religion. and totemic kinship, so that the white intrusion on the land itself became a kind of bloodless murder, even where no actual murder took place. Kath Walker gives voice to the anguish of the disposed, mourning the passing of an era and a way of life. Uh, so, this is uh, roughly the thing that I would like to. I am present before you for today, and I hope you have got some idea about modern Australian poetry. But one thing is very um clear, that you should have a mm, clear idea about Australian poetry and Australian short story and Australian novel. Otherwise, the mix-up will definitely create problems in the examination, which I could know from your responses. If not yours, at least the response of your seniors. That's why you kept, be careful about your approach in the examination. And any other problem, you can send me in the WhatsApp group which has been formed. And for today, we'll stop here. Thank you.